who's a terribly modest man and doesn't, won't sort of plug himself at all. But I hope you really enjoy his talk. I like most wonderful people, I met him over the internet and read a review of his book, Education's Upside Down, which, on the basis of the review, I bought and read. And it really is a fantastic book. And he came over to speak at the main Research Ed event in London in September, and his talk there was fascinating and hugely of interest to us here in the UK. So I really hope you enjoy Eric's talk, but if you've got a spare few quid, I'd really recommend, certainly a much better read than my book, for instance. But Eric.
Thank you. Thanks, David. I did not ask to be introduced because I don't have to be introduced, for goodness sakes. But I'm Eric. It is such a huge thrill to be here and see so many of you again, and new faces from when I was here in September. I was very thrilled to be a part of this, and have been speaking with folks throughout the day and kind of sharing some things about how I ended up here, because I'm probably the only American on the schedule. And that's a great honor to me, but it was this wonderful confluence of coincidence, basically. I basically went to Research Ed when it was in New York and begged to somehow be a part of Research Ed sometime, somewhere. And Tom said, well, if you can make it to London, that can happen in September. I made that happen, and shortly after that, David said, well, we're organizing also the literacy conference, and if you could come to that, we'd like that. So anyway, I was thrilled that my family, we were able to make it happen, and it's so wonderful to plug in with your community, especially because, and I've just talked about this over and over and over, we don't really have something like this in the US, okay? That's a real practitioner-driven improvement community, okay? And where the choice is all in the hands of the practitioners to come here on their own time, arrange for their own transportation. They're not necessarily sent here by their schools or paid for by their schools, and they're doing it all because they want to improve their craft. We don't really have something like that, at least not at the scale that we could call it a movement or something regular. So I'm deeply interested in where it happens because I believe that's the best way for us to make a big difference. At the same time, that's not typically how we have rolled this thing out in the US. Usually not to great results. Things come at the policy level, and changes don't necessarily get any better. And you're going to have to pardon me. I'm a very active sweater. And this is a hugely hot room. I had to go get a dabber. So I'll do this for a while. I'll do this for a while until I regulate. And it's just going to have to be that way. I'm on camera, which means I'm extra shiny all over the world. Anyway, so that's how I got to be at the literacy conference. It's also a great joy to me because though I think my book really tries to take kind of a comprehensive view of several education issues, literacy is absolutely where my heart is at. I began education as an English teacher for 10 years in a high school, teaching all levels. And in this high school, it was grades 10, 11, and 12. I taught journalism, advised the school newspaper, taught AP English, taught the school within the school for the kids who were really struggling readers, et cetera, et cetera. I love every part of this, and it's something that even though I work in schools in a very wide way now, I'm always really trained in on literacy instruction and what happens to be going on there, and then certainly the research next to it. So when David said if you could come and come to Research Ed Literacy, I was extra thrilled because it gives me a chance to really get my hands into something that I'm super passionate about, though I'm passionate about the whole enterprise. And here's the title. I'm a long titler, pardon me. I will explain what all of this means, okay? I promise. Now, this is the book that I wrote, and about that title, okay? This is something that I typically build into the beginning of every talk, only because I think educators will look at it and say, oh, he's one of those guys, okay? He's one of those guys that thinks everything is going wrong and that it's probably our fault, okay? Let me guess. In fact, there's a story I like to share about my own kids went and told their teachers, you know, my daddy's writing a book and he's in education and it's about education. The kids and the teachers are like, that is wonderful, you'll have to bring it in. And then they did, and the teachers were like, Oh, and to think I was nice with him at conferences. And so, you let me explain. Okay, it's basically based on this funnel metaphor, and that's why that's on the cover. Okay, and how I like to explain it is, if we have all of our streams of children, okay, across the expanse of all childhood, entering into one area, okay, a very good or effective funnel, okay, schooling, would pull them inward and down towards some expectable, predictably reliable set of skills, dispositions, habits, whatever, for our overall national good, okay? When you think of a funnel that way, okay? And if you don't like that idea, again, I go into much more detail in the book. And so, okay, I'm not just saying we're here to inculcate kids in a very specific way of thinking. It's just like we have to make it a little bit more reliable than we have. And there's several data, at least in the United States, to suggest that we're not producing anything very reliably, okay? And that's hurting both kids, but then obviously the institutions on the receiving end of the funnel. And what I say then is that what we actually have is an upside down funnel, and that is due to a lot of practices we've chosen. And that's what the funnel actually represents. And as such, if that is again, the expanse of childhood, the only people we can reliably say will make it through the funnel are the people who are closest to the mainstream to begin with, okay? Because of the practices we've chosen, we've actually had the opposite effect of what we want to do, okay? And that's really make everybody's lives better through this institution, okay? And in the US, again, there is just statistic after statistic showing that the only ones that school happens to work for are those who came from the families that are most mainstream to begin with, okay? Those are the only ones we can count on, not just bouncing off the funnel. So that's where it comes from. Education is upside down is not an indictment of a title as much as it is describing that metaphor, okay? Now, in the US, there are just a few symbols to help you understand what the rest of the book is about. Though I say that I argue that there are practices that have turned this funnel upside down and actually work against us as a whole and what we're trying to accomplish. Now we've entered the accountability era, okay? And in the accountability era, that's what the gentlemen boards and the sunglasses are to represent. They are mean, and they are here to look after that you're doing things the way they're supposed to be done, damn it, okay? That's who they represent. In the US, this is where we have tried to improve the most. When I say a research ed does not exist there, it's because the energy is getting poured into policy. So how is this represented? Labeling schools as failing, okay? Improving teacher evaluation systems statewide, okay? And not really improving curriculum. A number of ways that we can account for this thing because teachers are lazy bums, and that's how we got here. Okay, that's not what I think. Okay, that's what they think. Okay, and that's what they're here to do in the accountability era. We've also, in the accountability era, relied a lot on innovation. Okay, so we're going to innovate our way out of this problem. We're going to create red, shiny funnels that are also upside down. Okay, and iPad initiative, with all due respect to whoever believes in them, I haven't seen one work yet. Okay, but a one-to-one iPad initiative is a great way to personalize learning, but it would be, as my book argues, actually one of those things that was upside down to begin with. We just made it upside down-er. Okay, we did not necessarily address the root thing that makes personalized learning perhaps upside down if executed in a certain way. We just made it shinier, and thus it's not netting us much. Now, how does this all apply? Today's talk is really about just the practices, okay, or one part of the practices. And in chapter 5, I call that building skyscrapers on sand, as in, it actually begins there's a quote that begins it that's from St. Augustine, and it's basically, and I didn't put it up here, but the effect of it is, to get to the highest, you must start with the least. Okay, you must invest in your foundations. okay? I think that's an apt quote for these ideas because we're talking about the key pieces, okay, the threshold concepts. And this day has come full circle, by the way. I was sitting watching Phil, and I'm like, the things you were talking about, it was all teed up by Ray, 5 hours ago. It was so wonderful. And I definitely heard them in Joe's talk and other places. But the key things we need to do from a literacy standpoint that we will never be able to pull off if we don't start believing in them. And I basically make a few key assertions in here. One, that Bloom's taxonomy, that very classic and oft relied on organization of intellectual skills and habits I don't think it's totally useless. Okay, I think it's a decent description of certain levels. Okay, and I know that we could argue that. I do think it's horribly misapplied. Okay, and misunderstood even. Okay, and that's something I'll go into in a little bit. And also that reading isn't a skill. Okay, and it has to be stopped being viewed that way. Okay, it's really not a skill. It's many other things, and it makes a lot of things problematic when that's what you subscribe to. And this idea of lower order, as long as we're talking about Bloom's taxonomy, those things that would be classified as lower order skills are actually essential order skills or habits. Okay, and so these are kind of big assertions that this whole chapter runs on. Okay, so these practices that I'm asserting are upside down and causing some of our key issues. Mr. Bennett, thanks for joining us. I haven't gotten to say that in a long time. Anyway, and to do this, I start the chapter with an activity that I've done with a lot of reading instructors and principals over the years, and I would love for you guys to do it with me. Okay, and give you maybe a chance to talk to each other rather than just listen. Okay, I have a very brief handout. Could somebody help me? Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm not going to go into any of the details about this. Okay, you should each be able to take one. I don't think there are more here than I made. Please close read this distributed passage. And there's actually some directions there about how you should close read. You might have heard the term before. I'll pick up on that in a minute. Then afterward, with one or two neighbors, or individually if you'd rather not talk about it with anyone, work to complete the questions that are on the reverse side. Okay? I do urge you to work with someone to complete them. If you do want to keep it individual, please do. Thanks. And then we'll come back as a group and process it a little bit. Let's just call this, let's call it 3 minutes. It's a short passage. Oh, and if you've read my book and you already know what this is about, because again, it's pulled straight from there, please don't ruin the surprise. If you haven't begun the discussion part, I do urge you to kind of rush through the passage so you could take a good 2 minutes to talk with each other. In the interest of time, just take about another 30 seconds. If you haven't gotten to get through more than, say, one of the questions, just move to another one. Okay, so at least two have been somewhat, like, dealt with. Okay. I hope your daughter's okay.
Yeah, oh, she's fine. She's been through enough.
Okay.
I better get home. So thank you so
All right,
much.
so great
Yeah,
to see you.
I'll be in touch.
Be in touch anytime.
Thank you, David. Brilliant. Yeah, thanks for coming. I really appreciate it.
Great to meet you. Take care. All right, let's come together, shall we? Okay, there's the passage. There's the post-reading questions. Actually, I've left two off there. I will circle to those. Anyone, what's the passage above describing? And I don't want right answers. I just want anything that came up. Yes, ma'am. Some sort of sports commentary. Thank you. Others, there's some kind of game going on. Yes, ma'am. Gotcha. Sorry. And again, pulled it straight from the book. Sometimes I didn't necessarily edit. Pardon me if that, it should have said below. Sorry if my instructions were bad. You caught me. You're right. Yes, ma'am. Could be business. This could be related to some sort of transaction. Okay? Just in some sort of technical speak. Thank you. Is there anything else that would go outside of it's a game, a sport, perhaps some sort of business interaction? Yes, ma'am? Yeah, it could, this could be like a battle formation, okay, in some sort of way. It reads like that, and I could ask folks for, and we could go on with this. Trust me, for a long time. I could say, what sorts of clues told you that, thus and so. And I'll take one more, ma'am. Did you have? Yeah. There's something going on. Because we have there's body parts described, okay? There are heel marks, okay? Anyway, other things I've heard over time. This is plumbing, okay? This is something mechanical, okay? Someone believed it was, is this a way of describing lead getting into a mechanical pencil? Okay, what's the first sentence say? We couldn't get lead going, oh shoot, but what if that's lead? Okay, basically what you have here is something that's so devoid of you knowing what it is that's why question 6 is there, is when you really think about it, are there any words there you don't know? Room full of college-educated educators. Are there words you don't know? There aren't, okay? Aside from the acronyms, I'll fill that in. Aside from the acronyms, okay, or the abbreviations, there's no word in there you don't know, okay? Because this goes beyond not just comprehending. This is erasing the meaning from words you have known, probably since you were 8. Okay, so think about that. And basically what this is a demonstration, much like Joe brought up in her talk today, which she was citing work from Daisy Christodoulou. Okay, sorry. I had to check pronunciations of her name, David's, once upon a time. I'm like, I'm going to have to say that out loud at some point. I don't want to stumble all over the place. But when you have a knowledge gap or a knowledge deficit, it does more than mess with your comprehension. It can actually erase the meaning from words that you knew, okay? And I think a lot of people, when they see that that's true, that's kind of eye-opening for them. What it is, it's a football play, okay? American football, sorry. And if you say, oh, I'm sure when he reads this in America, everyone says, of course, no, okay? Because that's very technical coach speak, okay? I was a football coach. I was a football player in college. I have a favorite team that I watch every single week. All of that makes perfect sense to me, and I'll show you in a moment. But what I always think is interesting is no matter what you think of Bloom's, there are a lot of people who organize their teaching according to Bloom's, yeah? Okay, and they say we need to get to the higher order thinking skills quicker. I know that's how we do it in America. Like, again, that's one of the misapplications that I kind of argue in my book, is when we go to that level and assume knowledge, okay, or discount the importance of background knowledge to making meaning, there's no way you can access the top levels. And it just, you know, to kind of demonstrate that, all of these questions are actually aligned to levels on Bloom's, right? It's like that first one, do you know the main idea? If you do, you can comprehend it. Okay, if you could not, okay, strike one. Okay, there was no way then that you could make a diagram, right? Or apply it to a different situation, right? And you could certainly not analyze it and say, make an inference. How many inference drills on this passage would you have had to do before you would have come up with that's a football coach? You know? I mean, nevertheless, it's what we do. Not we, some. And you certainly couldn't evaluate. And if that's the highest level of Bloom's taxonomy, there's no way you could make a good judgment on this, all because you did not have the knowledge at that lowest level to comprehend the passage. Okay? And it's about a football coach. And it's adjustments that a team made to a play. This is exactly from a situation that I was in, of all things. I could show you all of the parts of this. Okay? I could say, okay, well, remember how it said B gap? He was going to B gap. There's B gap. Okay? Right there. Okay? In this formation. Okay? And these are the numbers of the holes that runners are actually aiming at for this play. Okay? And let's get into some of the terms as long as they were there. We have guards that go right there. We have tackles that go right there. Because we had a play that was going on this side of the formation, our play side tackle and play side guard, you read PSG and PST in there, that's where they would go. And then you had H, there he is. Okay? And you had T, there he is. Okay? Got that? Good, because here's on the defensive side. On the defensive side, we were talking about fives, doing things like smashing across the face. Okay? There's 5 that I'm talking about. Okay? And we had other players who are in this formation as well. We have a weak side linebacker, a middle linebacker. We have a free safety, buck linebacker, strong. Okay? And if I say, let's drop them out and call them what we called them in the play. We called them not Will, and they had fun names like Will and Mike. Okay, so Will was going to press hard in the alley, and Mike, and this 2I that I talked about, that's because he's a 2, but on the inside, you get my message. Okay, this is some of the knowledge you would have needed, and I haven't even gotten into what happened in the play, and I'm not going to either. We're done with this. But you get it. There's so much knowledge for someone to know to start putting this together for it to make any sense. And that's what writers do. Okay? Writers leave gaps. Huge ones. If they didn't, every piece of writing would be 700 pages long. Okay? If they explained every little thing. This is a crucial piece. Dan Willingham goes on just at length about this. E.D. Hirsch was onto this even before cognitive science caught up with him. Okay, as he kind of noticed, I have a lot of readers in college that just don't know stuff. And so when I throw a really complex literary work at them, they don't have it. And so he found that he had to really install that. It was actually what got him interested in thinking about education. He was a higher ed professor to start. But because writers leave such large gaps, it's kind of on teachers to figure out how exactly to put some of that in. And obviously, as I've heard just echoed throughout the day, that has to be strategic. You can't put all the knowledge in, but that's, Phil just walked out, but that's one of the things that definitely he and his staff are kind of taking on, sounds like, is saying, what's it gonna be? Okay, or in Joe's talk, she talked about also about the maps that her staffs are setting up to really say, I can't put all of this knowledge in, but I'm gonna locate some things that are particularly crucial to a comprehension. And then after enough time, the student begins to actually accumulate huge bodies, okay? And across our history coursework and things like that, and science and whatnot. Now, why is this bad news? Back to that image. In the accountability era, there is great pressure to increase assessment scores. And in the US, and again, I can't pretend to know exactly how it is here, but in the US, this is a couple of ways. Your school can actually be put into various status that affects your day. If you are named a focus school, people will come in and make sure your focus plan is followed, okay? Which removes a lot of autonomy from staff, which is not necessarily a good thing, and you get all kinds of things that crop up because of it. Also, teachers, we have value-added modeling. I don't know if you've heard of that, but that's basically like, your students on average grew this much, you are not a quality teacher, okay? As opposed to, yours grew this much, you are a quality teacher. And it's based on these test scores, so folks obviously very, very motivated to get those scores up. Thing is, this isn't good when you don't necessarily know the stuff before. Okay, if you don't really practice with the idea that knowledge is crucial, and you treat literacy skill building as a skill, you're just gonna throw really bad practice over and over at kids. Just harder and faster because of the new accountability climate, okay? And when that becomes true, now we're doing the wrong thing. One example I like to use, and certain districts I've worked in saw the reading scores go down in certain schools, so they said, well, in those schools, what we're gonna do, we're gonna clear the decks of the content areas. So, and this isn't more in elementary than in secondary, but in elementary you might see science, social studies, they're canceled until the 4th grade. Okay, we're just gonna do reading because our numbers say reading needs to increase. Okay, and so they treat it like it's a workout program or something. Like, more working out with reading will just make you a stronger reader, and it's like, no, you're actually taking away the things that help build a stronger reader or comprehender. Now, when I say doing it wrong, comprehension strategies is what I mean. I don't know if you guys have seen these books, and sitting with David, I get more like ideas for titles I have to be reading, because things that you guys read here don't necessarily make it to the States, and vice versa. But these types of books, 7 Keys to Comprehension, Strategies at Work, Reading with Meaning, I've seen schools build their entire literacy professional development plan on books like these. Okay, where it's like, we're gonna do that inference strategy, and we're gonna do it as a team, and we're gonna measure our results, and sometimes you're just helpless because you can't necessarily, without kind of teaching the essential pieces of knowledge building, for instance, it's hard to tell someone this probably isn't getting you much anywhere. And I call it active reading practice, and people hear me say that and they think I mean active reading. No, the act of reading, like building the act of it. You do things like higher order thinking practice, okay? Like I say, you read a piece and you have the kids infer, okay? Like there's 10 questions asking in various ways to make inferences, as though inferencing is just a thing that can be built by drill, and then comprehension doesn't really increase. And again, if you ever see Dan Willingham, he's done a lot of stuff on this going back to 2006 or 7, where he was just like, do reading comprehension strategies work? And he went deep into the literature on that. And I have some references at the end of this too, that when I post my slides, you guys can look them up. But he basically has found and just asserted over and over and over that there is some benefit. You usually get a short-term bump, okay, if you use these types of strategies. But doing it 50 times is no more effective than doing it 10. Okay, which indicates that the thing that they do is not necessarily build reading comprehension, but builds kids understanding that writing is about communication. and here's how you pick apart a piece of writing. Other than that, once they've got that down, the gains diminish after a while. Also doing it wrong, close reading, that thing I just had you do, okay? Close reading, this term in the US, and I asked David about this a little while ago, I'm like, I think you guys would just call this analysis, right? So like, we're gonna analyze a poem. Close reading's different than just an analysis, in that what it is it's that skill-based approach to reading. Okay, I know why our scores are low. We just didn't read closely enough before. Okay, and to me, I'm just going to say it. That is in the U.S. That is a desperate enterprise. Okay, that say when people started to like apply pressure that things need to improve, they went, we don't know how to improve it, so we're going to double down on the skills idea. And one of the things, I don't know if you see this, I just pulled this off some poor middle school's website, because I know that this is how they're having their kids read everything now. Okay, they probably haven't gone much deeper on the idea of building knowledge explicitly, so they're saying, read more closely, kids, and strategically when you do, and that'll fix everything. I find this term then ironic. Do you know what DOK is? Depth of knowledge. Okay, which is ironic because as you go higher, apparently your knowledge deepens without ever doing that. Like I asked you guys to read, what does it say? How does the author say it? What does it mean and why does that matter? Like what connections can you make to this? Did you become any more knowledgeable about football, American football, through that passage? Until I started to say, and then there's the, there's the tackle and there's the A bit. That's when you got more knowledgeable. Not by much, I wasn't trying to make that a very in-depth study, but you know what I'm saying. To close read is not, at least as we're defining it, is not necessarily a knowledge builder either. It's a skill building exercise. And what I would say is what goes around definitely comes around. We have this thing called the Common Core National Standards, or Common Core State Standards of Learning, and they're probably the most explicitly knowledge-dependent and text complexity reliant sets of standards we've ever had. And basically, it's a bad thing. I like the Common Core standards, but it's a bad thing because I think the folks that authored them, and I was talking earlier with another attendant, the folks that authored them did not know how much we don't understand the knowledge relationship. They read E.D. Hirsch, they read Willingham, they said, oh yeah, that's how reading is, so let's just like write standards that go according to that without recognizing that the entire enterprise didn't really see things that way. They still see it as a skill, okay? And so basically we're gonna get a really neat picture over the next 4 or 5 years of just how mismatched that is. Okay, and I would just call it, it's a mutual practitioner and reformer error in this case. Okay, to say, oh, teachers just start doing it like that is basically to go against how a lot of us are trained. Okay, and that is that it's a skill piece, or the resources that they give us to use. We'll have, I gave you some before. People believe it's a strategy, you can get better, and here's what some of the results have shown so far. Kentucky, this was the first state to actually give tests that were aligned. They had a third in a drop in proficiency. Okay, so imagine seeing that in the newspaper. New standards are coming in. We're the first in the union to give the tests. It's like, oh my goodness. We thought we were doing great. We were 76% proficient in 2010 and 11, and by 2011, 12, under 50%. Why? Well, test is just harder. New York had the same thing. Okay, in that they went down 51.1%, by the way, of that total. Okay, so 51% of 44 brought you down to 31.1. That made a lot of people very nervous. And my home state, Minnesota, that's just a graph with a 5-year trend. You can see where the new test kicked in. Okay, the thing I like better, what happens after? What's that? Which would indicate what? Or did we do anything different? A lot of the schools that I worked with in my state, they'd say, okay, we think we're gonna really knock next year's tests out of the water, and I said, I don't think you will. And they say, well, really? You've been working? And I'm like, yeah, but you didn't really do anything different. You know what I mean? You might have paid more attention to it. You might have assessed it more closely, but you really just used the same curriculum, right? I'm like, you maybe gave more help to kids. I'm like, but really, this, is not necessarily that. Here's a Minneapolis public school district. That's the biggest city in my home state. You can see a line that follows a very similar pattern. And that's all grades. Okay, so there was a significant initial loss and then the fairly flat line since. This is where I start getting concerned, though, as someone who really, really cares about this stuff. Both of these schools, and the names have been blacked out to protect the folks that are working there. The purple lines, okay, these are schools where there's super high poverty, okay? I won't tell you who they are. You don't need to know. You don't even know where Minnesota is, much less where these schools would be in their biggest metro. But I'll tell you this, they're both schools with significant numbers of kids in poverty, okay? This one is a K-8, okay, so kindergarten through 8th grade, and this one's a high school. You can see where the new test kicked in that is more knowledge-based, right? And you can see what's happened after. It's actually going slightly down, even though they're not very far from the floor to begin with. Similarly here, the test kicked in, and they're just like losing. The longer kids are in the system, the further they get away in this school, and this is like back to my funnel to begin with. Okay, who's succeeding? Not the poor kids. Not the kids who need this most. In fact, it's actually making it harder on them. And basically, we're not showing many signs of recovering that. And that one's really, really hard for me. But as you can see, the Common Core, it's a great thing in that it'll be a great thing if it adjusts practice, but so far it has not. We'll see. Now, what can we do about all this? It's definitely stuff that I've heard throughout the day. I heard Summer say it. I heard Joe say it. I heard Phil say it. To remember that our mission is to teach how to comprehend, analyze, and be moved by literature, okay? And to actually just give in to the idea that this may take some doing with students' low background knowledge, okay? I once again, cannot pretend to know exactly how it's done in the grades that lead up to secondary in Britain, but I can tell you that when kids would get to me, it only took me a few years as a teacher to go, holy, they do not understand anything. Sorry, they understand a lot. There was a lot they didn't know, okay? That I was not able to help them comprehend some of the wonderful things in the literature I was teaching them. I have to go out of my way to provide that. So prepare to install background knowledge per the work's key themes. You can't install everything. Was anybody just in Phil's? When Phil starts rolling out the sections from going all the way back to Virgil onto Milton, and you're just like, oh, you could never know all of this stuff. How would you teach that to a bunch of kids who certainly haven't seen it? You can't do everything. You have to be strategic, and that's why I would advise to look at really key themes from your work. Something Crucible, I understand that's taught here fairly commonly. There are several, it's very rich with possible themes to be discussed with your kids. Which ones do they need to know more about to truly know what should be comprehended exiting that, okay? I doubt that my students before me knew anything about McCarthyism, okay? I doubt that they knew anything about what Arthur Miller was really writing that play to talk about, okay? Or what he's said he would. And weave that basically into all unit planning, even if it means telling occasionally. Telling's okay. And connect to neighboring disciplines and leverage that as possible. If you learn of somebody that is teaching something that happens roughly at the same historical period that the work you're teaching occurs in, might be a good idea to figure out how to connect and have you all enrich one another's content. As leaders, okay, so as the type of people who would come to something like Research Ed in hopes that you could get good practice to bring back to your building, please keep pushing on questions like these. If it gets hard to talk about sometimes, just push them on their readiness for these texts, okay? What are you doing to get them there? What did you tell them about the 1920s to better understand The Great Gatsby? Okay, and do you need to? And also really continuing to build or chip away at, maybe is a better term, the ideas of how limited it is when we approach reading as though it's a skill. that can just be built through continual hammering on the upper end of Bloom's. Okay, we're trying it in the US. You see where our reading scores are going. Okay, and that is nothing compared to how our kids are tanking once they hit college. Okay, if you were at my September presentation, I talked about that there. We're talking about a 40% completion rate. Like, you did everything it took to get into college, and then only 2 out of 5 actually graduate. And we have huge reams of college readiness literature that also say we have very low numbers of kids who are able to handle those rigors before they get there. Anyway, if you're looking for literature that can actually back some of the limits of comprehension strategies to maybe keep that conversation going in an evidence-based way in your school, do look at the end of this. I have credits and suggested references. Also, if you just Google Willingham reading comprehension strategies, you'll have more than enough research to go on. And a lot of his is in a very research review way, or that's how it's presented, with ample links to others. And then also curriculum. Curriculum does matter, okay? Do you have what you need across disciplines to support literacy goals? Garrett, we were talking out, and that was one of the first things, history teacher. We're talking outside, and as the questions I was asking him, and I almost always circle around to, so what curriculum do you get to use? And I kind of learned that, well, some of us have to kind of create it on our own. If that's what you must do it. I just know that that's a huge time commitment and labor commitment. All that said, I think I'm down to about 3 minutes. But I didn't go overtime. In September, I went overtime and made people miss lunch. Are there any questions or points folks would like to share with the room? Yes.
As an American myself, I'm actually from Omaha,
Hey.
Nebraska, and as I've been here, it's probably really good professional development-wise if you could come and maybe be released to come and observe UK schools, both secondary and primary. So when you go to these talks, you can actually say, well, the States is doing this, but Britain's doing this way, and actually we're being successful in this and this and this. That might help you with your next book, or it might help those teachers if you talk to them in the States or talk to them here, and help them be motivated to take it to that next step.
I would love to have time like that. So, and in fact, some folks were generous enough in September to say, if you can stretch out how long you can be here, could you ever come by my school? Loved that idea, just couldn't make it work. Would really love to do that. I would love to just keep the conversation going with folks that I've been meeting, just because there's enough overlap that it's like, it's free.